Welcome, everyone, to tonight's program. And I think you all are really going to be in for a treat. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know about some upcoming programs. Next Tuesday at 6:00 p.m., Dr. Ken Bailey is going to present Scratch 'em and Sue 'em, which is about the post-Civil War legal cases involving former Confederates. And then a month from now on, Tuesday, December 4th, is when we're going to have our annual showcase. And fittingly, with respect to tonight's subject, it's going to deal with duty and honor. It's a military theme for the showcase. And actually, our tonight's speaker, she's going to be present to talk about some of the resources that she has used here at the archives for the research that she is doing for us. We already have a number of speakers who are scheduled for our Tuesday night programs in next year, and we try to list those in our monthly newsletter, and we also have them on our website. So please check one of those to see what our upcoming Tuesday night programs are. Tonight, Patricia McClure is going to discuss a very appropriate topic for the week before Veterans Day, WVU's 1942 NIT championship basketball team and service in World War II. The World War II generation is one that, as we all know, is rapidly passing from us, but one thing Pat's research confirms is the deep commitment the men and women of that era demonstrated to winning the war. Pat is a former associate professor of English at West Virginia State University. She holds a bachelor's degree from Baldwin Wallace University and a master's from Ohio University. For several years now, she has been a volunteer here at the archives, where she researches and writes profiles of West Virginians who are included on the Veterans Memorial, and she specializes in World War II. If you check out the biographies for the Veterans Memorial that we have online, you will find several dozen that Pat has prepared on individuals who died while in service. Those who have read Archives and History News may also recall that Pat has written a couple of articles related to her research that we used in the newsletter. And when she identified the basketball team connection among some of the men about whom she was writing, she wrote an article that appeared in the most recent issue of the West Virginia Historical Society's publication. Pat has continued to explore the subject since, so we all will be able to hear about that. And please join me in welcoming Pat McClure.
Thank you, Mary. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a tiny little place, there were 5 handsome, smart, determined young men. And those men were on a quest. Their quest would take them to a big, big metropolis in their nation, and they couldn't do it all by themselves. It would take them to a venue that everybody had heard of, but nobody had heard of these 5 handsome, smart young men. They couldn't do it all by themselves. So they decided to add to their number some people that they had enlisted from the outside. And they went to a larger, more sophisticated place and picked up a couple more people to join them in their quest. It was New Jersey. And then they added to their number by picking up a handsome, undauntable leader. And they all rode off into the night, and they accomplished their quest. If this sounds like a fairy tale, we would expect to have a happy ever after ending. But you can see from the title and the subtitle, it was 1942, and it's about veterans, And so we know that the ending cannot be entirely happy. Mary's kind of filled you in on how I got started on this particular topic, but it just happened to be the conjunction of several interesting things that I was working on. And I read, well, you all read in the paper, every March, what comes up in the paper. A big front page article about March Madness, and usually there's something in about the 1942 West Virginia University basketball team that won the big national championship. And that, at that time, the big national championship was the NIT. Now, when we talk about March Madness, we look at the NCAA tournament, and it's kind of eclipsed by the NIT is kind of eclipsed by the NCAA tournament. But the NIT was the big national championship at the time. And WVU was seeded 8th in a group of 8 teams. So it looked as though they just didn't have a chance. My work with archives has been mostly to write online biographies of men and women who are listed on the West Virginia Veterans Memorial. And you can see a picture. It, I think, is one of the most beautiful memorials I've ever seen. And it's simple, but very, very moving. I was lucky enough to be in D.C. a few weeks ago, and for the first time I saw the World War II memorial there. And it also is moving, but it just didn't grab me the way that the memorial here does. So I started working, as I read this article in the Charleston Daily Mail, I realized that this wasn't just a great basketball team. They were just on the cusp of something bigger that was going to happen in their lives, even though they had a relatively short-lived celebration in New York and in Morgantown. Something bigger was going on at the time. You have a handout. If you didn't get a handout, would you raise your hand and I'll bring one around? Sums it all up. It wasn't a very big team. There weren't very many players on the team, and the players that were on the team weren't very big themselves, so it just wasn't a very big team. There were 5 starters, and that was it. The captain, Rudy Barrett, and I'm going to go through these in alphabetical order and tell you more about them, but you can see that there were 5 starters, there were 3 subs. Yes, I know, I've listed 4. But we'll get into why there are 4 listed there a little bit later on. The 4th was one of those guys recruited from New Jersey. There were 2 co-managers. The main manager was Charles Bud Lawal, and there was a co-manager, Charles Wilson. And one article I read just recently also said that the younger brother of Roger Shorty Hicks, U. Hicks, was also a co-manager, so I listed him here, and he says he was a manager of the sophomore team at the time, and then a coach. So it was a relatively small group that went to New York, for the tournament. There was an article in Time magazine that occurred right after the tournament, and if you think that West Virginia doesn't get much respect now, listen to this. West Virginia University has a funny-looking basketball team. In a sport where height pays off, It has only one player over 6 feet, Rudy Barrett, right guard. Roger Hicks, left forward, is little larger or huskier than a jockey, while Scotty Hamilton, the other forward, is a real fat boy. Compared to most, Dick Kessling is virtually a runt. The team's gold and blue shirts have white jersey half sleeves like those worn by British track athletes and give the impression that they were run up by the players' mothers or that the boys forgot to remove their underwear. Coach Dyke Raese is a dead ringer for Hollywood's Humphrey Bogart. That was the most complimentary thing they had to say. But then the second paragraph starts out, but there's nothing funny about West Virginia's performance. So we finally, after a whole paragraph of running West Virginia down, we finally get to the fact that there really is something good going on here. The press back home was a lot more complimentary. Some more recent writers have said that the press was dominated entirely by the war that was going on, because in 1942, early 1942, the Pacific Theater was taking up most of the people's attention. But in reality, the Morgantown press was giving the basketball team almost equal coverage on the front page to the war. So everybody's attention was divided between these two things: the war's going on, the basketball teams in New York, and all that. And people were glued to their radios. You'll see a picture that I have later on of people listening to it on the radio. We're so used to having television and other media now that we don't realize how captivating listening to a program on the radio could be. But people were really glued to their radios at the time. And the school children were really interested in, and they sent cards of congratulation. They sent their pennies as donations for the team to travel. Children all over the state were excited about this. It was something that the state was really pumped up about. Nearly 70 years later, George Homan, who writes for the Daily Mail, writes in retrospect, amid the darkest and most perilous days of World War II, the WVU basketball team provided a welcoming and uplifting diversion for West Virginians. My synopsis of the season, and I want to talk a little bit about the season, and I want to talk a little bit about the game, but most of all, I want to focus on the players themselves. My synopsis of the season is based primarily on a book by Norman Julian, which I rechecked out of the public library today, Legends. It's a very small book, but if you're interested in sports, this has a lot about West Virginia basketball players, including Jerry West. But I used it for my research on the 1942 team. The other interesting book I had was that when Coach Dyke Raese was nominated to be in a Naismith Hall of Fame, his son Charles Raese did a book on him so that he could document the things that his father did. He says that he put the book together rather hastily, and therefore it's not a very large book, but he very graciously sent that book to me, and I'll pass it around. And of course, there were a lot of newspaper articles. I was able to use newspaper articles from the time period, and also every year a lot of things are written about this team. So sometimes it seems as though nothing new can be said, but every once in a while I would find some new statistic or some new fact. This is a picture of the team itself. In the front row you see Floyd Scotty Hamilton, Luke Kalmar, Rudy Barrett. Rudy was the captain of the team and the tallest one on the team. And then Roger Shorty Hicks. Now I wouldn't have given Roger Shorty Hicks that nickname because I'm not sure that he was all that short. But he was a very slight fellow. and Dick Hessling is next to him. In the back row, you have Coach Raese, and you can judge for yourself whether he really does look like Humphrey Bogart. George Rickey, who was another one from New Jersey, and Neil Montone. And one thing I like about this picture, I took it straight out of the Monticola, the WVU yearbook, but I think the height that Neil Montone has is due to his hair, and I would think of him as the big hair guy. Donald Raese was the nephew. He was a sub on the team, and he was the nephew of Coach Dyke Raese. And then next to him is Walter Lefty Rollins, and then manager Charles Bud Lawal. So that is the team. And you can see them all, their names on the handout. In the book Legends, Norman Julian writes about the team and calls the season when last became first. He starts by saying, quote, "Victory and defeat, ecstasy and agony were what 1942 was all about. Toss in a fairy tale about Cinderella and you have the essence of how it was." In Morgantown newspapers, reports of WVU's basketball team were presented on the one-page sports sections. The front pages were filled with stories about World War II. And as I said, in reality, the front pages were really devoted to both the war and the team. And as time went on, it was more and more about the team and less about the war. As I talk about the season and the tournament, I will rely on some readings, primarily because I don't happen to be, I'm a sports enthusiast, but I'm not knowledgeable, not all that knowledgeable about sports. So one of the things I'll be doing is reading to you some of the things that I found interesting about that particular year. This again is from Norman Julian, who says, quote, "Fourth-year coach Dyke Raese had convened his squad in mid-October of '41, but after America entered the war December 7th, he knew that he and his players would soon have greater concerns. On campus, though, as throughout the planet, the news was mostly of war and preparations of war. Basketball joined the mix in curious ways. On February 11th, WVU routed Army 57-40, and I'll throw in a sidebar of my own there. A lot of the accounts that I read said that the regular season game against Army was the big game. It was what made WVU stand up and get noticed." Going back to what Norman Julian says, the next day, Don Raese, nephew of the WVU coach, accepted an appointment to West Point. Again, a sidebar. I don't think he ever matriculated at West Point. I could not find it. And somebody in the audience is shaking his head. I never found that he ended up going to West Point, so that's kind of a sad, ironic thing there. By the time WVU accepted a bid to the National Invitation Tournament in March, about 6,000 Monongalia men had registered for the draft. That included many of WVU's 3,000 students. So that kind of gives you an idea of how big the school was at the time. 3,000 students at WVU. These are the starting five with Coach Raese, Scotty Hamilton. Now, Scotty Hamilton keeps being referred to as being fat or roly-poly, and yet by today's standards, if you look at that picture, he isn't all that heavy. He was heavy by the standards, by the 1942 standards. And then next to him, Lou Palmar, Dick Hessling, Roger Shorty Hicks, and Rudy Barrett, the tall 6'3" guy. This is, and you don't have this on your handout because I was trying to be a minimalist to save trees, but this is what the season turned out to be. They started out by winning against Geneva, that's in Pennsylvania. Notice the mix of big schools and small schools, or what we think of today as big schools and small schools here. They started out winning against Geneva. Look at that margin of victory over Maryland, 63 to 36. And we know that would have been a bigger school. Duquesne, they lost that one, but they only lost it by 8 points. They beat Youngstown 55 to 33, Carnegie Tech 48 to 40. The pattern I see there is that when they win pretty big, and when they lose by rather small margins. And I thought that was an impressive thing. That does also include the tournament games, that particular slide does. I've already mentioned that the Army game, 57 to 40, that was the pivotal game of the regular season. Now, about the style of play, again, I want to do some reading because not being a sports writer, not knowing a great deal about basketball myself, but finding some interesting things about the style of play. This is from Charles Race's book about his father. And when I say Race in this context, I'm talking about Dyke Raese, the coach. Quote, Race believed in a dribbling fast break in which the guard would receive the outlet pass and drive down the middle with two players flanking him on each side. Hamilton fit the middleman role perfectly. After receiving the outlet pass, Hamilton would storm down the court and not surrender the ball until he was challenged by a defender. If left unchallenged, he took the shot himself. Hamilton was smart and he had an uncanny knack for knowing when and to whom he should pass the ball, end quote. Charles Race said that his father's philosophy on foul shooting was this, quote, if a player was a good foul shooter, I left him alone. However, if he wasn't, I taught him to shoot underhanded. That produces a softer shot and gives a poor shot a better chance of falling in. Okay, those of you who are sports enthusiasts do understand what I'm talking about there. I sort of do. Some more about the team and about their style of play. With a team short of stature as well as talent, Race decided he needed to feature a ball control offense and a tenacious zone defense if he was going to have any success. As he put it, we had to starve the other team of the ball until we had a sure basket. To accomplish this, Race installed an overloaded zone with 3 players down one side, one in the pivot, and another guard on the opposite side of the foul line. He was extremely innovative in his approach to ball handling. While most coaches discouraged deceptive passing, he demanded it. He taught his players that the best way to fake an opponent was to move their body in one direction and pass in the opposite. Race demanded finesse, deception, and above all, rapid-fire ball movement. His players passed behind their backs, through their legs, behind their heads, and at times even rolled the ball on the floor. Most coaches would have benched their players for such actions. Race applauded this. Does that style of play remind you of anything or anybody? The Globetrotters. Exactly. And that's what Charles Race liked, likens their style of play too. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the tournament itself. You can see when we get down to the last 3 games, Long Island, Toledo, and Western Kentucky, that's the tournament. There are 8 teams. You have quarterfinals, you have semifinals, and you have finals. The first game, seeded WVU faced Long Island University. Long Island University was coached by Claire B. B is a big name in West Virginia. Lots of people named B in West Virginia. As a matter of fact, my uncle married a B in Ritchie County. But Claire B was the coach at Long Island University. He was a native of West Virginia and was well respected as a coach, but he had also written sports books for boys at the time. So he was quite a well-known guy. WVU goes in, they're the 8th seed, and they pull it out 58 to 49. 9-point spread there, that's pretty good. Before the game, Coach Raese had said, quote, "If we are hitting like we have in some games in the regular season and hit like that through the entire game, we have a chance." He would go on to say, quote, "Because we were so small, we had to do something different to win." And when they did, by pulling it out 58 to 49 in overtime by doing something different. Norman Julia reports that at every tournament game in Madison Square Garden that year, it was sold out, and between 500 to 1,000 fans stood outside and listened to the game on loudspeakers. By that time, WVU had captured the imagination of New Yorkers, and the excitement was beginning to be felt throughout the nation, even though, as we said, the nation was weighed down by the serious issues of the day. In the semifinals, of course, Toledo was favored, but WVU won that 51 to 39. And again, that 12 points is a good point spread. According to some analysts, WVU and Western Kentucky went into the finals on an even keel, although some people believe that WVU remained the underdog throughout the whole time. One more thing to read to you now, then we'll stop playing first grade. The championship final at Western Kentucky topped even the LIU contest for excitement, as a capacity crowd of 18,250 turned out to see West Virginia make 3 free throws in the final 45 seconds to cap a thrilling comeback victory. The Mountaineers may have been the underdog with the handicappers, but they were the favorite with the crowd. So finally, they're getting some respect. Western Kentucky took a commanding 32 to 24 lead into the locker room at halftime, but the Mountaineers came storming back out and knotted the game at 40-40 with 8 minutes to go. With less than a minute to go, Kessling sank a foul shot to tie the game at 45-45. It remained tied with 10 seconds left when Roger Hicks, who never missed a foul shot the entire tournament. Want me to say that again? Roger Hicks, who never missed a foul shot the entire tournament, cashed in another free throw to give the Mountaineers the lead. They then regained the ball and held it until Hamilton was fouled. He added another point to end the contest at 47 to 45. Barrick scored 17 points and set a new season scoring mark for the Mountaineers in the process. He was named the tournament's most valuable player. Hamilton and Kessling joined him in placing on the NIT all-tournament team. Raese, that's Coach Dyke Raese, Barrick, Hamilton, and Kessling remained in New York for 2 extra days for an Army emergency benefit game, in which the NIT All-Stars, coached by Raese, played an all-star military team. When they returned to Morgantown, the Mountaineers were greeted with a tumultuous celebration. They were paraded through the downtown business section, and the following evening they were honored at a banquet headed by Governor Neely. And I'll add another sidebar in here, and that is that no couches were burned at the time. People just snaked through the streets and enjoyed it that way. Okay, let's get down to the real reason we're here this evening, and that's for me, it's to honor the men who were on this team and tell a little bit about them, because I think they are really some spectacular people. The captain, and these are in alphabetical order. I couldn't decide in what order to put them in, and you might look at it and say, well, you're doing it from tallest to shortest because Captain Rudy Barrick was the only one over 6 feet tall on the whole team. But actually, they're alphabetical. Rudy Barrick was from Benwood in Marshall County, and his parentage was Yugoslavian. I believe his mother was a first-generation American, and his father had been here for, his father's family had been here for a couple generations. But one thing you'll find out about the men on this team, they all came from relatively similar middle-class, good old West Virginia backgrounds. Rudolph Barrick was named Most Valuable Player in the NIT tournament. And the strange thing about, one of the strange things about him was he stayed at the university after Coach Raese left and became the coach for 1 year. His being this 1-year coach, it enabled him to fulfill his ROTC commitment, and that way he could go out and become commissioned as an officer when he did leave the university. Charles Raese says this of Rudy Barrick, quote, "Rudy Barrick was not a giant by any means. However, he had unusually long arms, much like those of Jerry West. Barrick was an excellent shot from close range, a great defensive player, and a solid rebounder. Furthermore, he gave the team a physical presence they had been lacking." When interviewed by Sandy Wells for the Charleston Gazette-Mail, Hugh Hicks, the brother of team member Roger Hicks, says this about Barrick's, quote, "He was a big fellow and very quiet. There was no pizzazz about him, but he won many a game on his ability to rebound the ball," unquote. When Rudy Barrick assumed the coaching duties the following year, by that time the university began to recognize the basketball program as for its importance, and for the first time in 1943, for the 1942-43 season, scholarships were awarded. By that time, it was almost entirely a sophomore team because the freshmen had their own team, and the sophomores were all new, and the only returning player was Scotty Hamilton, who happened to be a junior. As far as his service record goes, I couldn't find anything in the U.S. Army World War II enlistment records, 1938 to 46. That's a document, a series of documents that I used to look up facts about servicemen, and I couldn't find anything in there about Rudy Barrick. But another document called the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Burrell's Death File, and I may refer to this again from time to time, shows an enlistment date 1 for Rudy Barrick in August of 1942 with a release date in December 43. And that would indicate that, but he never seemed to have fulfilled that, and that would seem to indicate that he was given time, a deferment perhaps, I'm not sure that would be the word that was used back then, but time to fulfill his ROTC duties and his coaching duties for 1 year at WVU before going on. And he actually enlisted, his enlistment 2 date was December 13th of 1943, and he wasn't released until June 15th, 1946. So we do know that after his coaching duties and his playing days were over, Rudy Barrick did go on and serve in World War II. The second player I'm going to talk about is Floyd Scotty Hamilton. Scotty Hamilton started playing basketball early in his life. He appears to have been brought up in the household of his grandmother, Lula Hamilton Perrine. Some sources said that he was brought up in the household of his great-grandmother, but this census data and ages and so forth, the great-grandmother seems to be ruled out. I do believe that Lula Hamilton Perrine was his grandmother, according to the 1930 census. And it was this woman, and the woman in whose household he was brought up, who decided that he would go to WVU and play for Coach Dyke Raese. And the reason she decided that was that Coach Raese came to the home. He was impeccably groomed and very polite. And how do grandmothers feel about that? That's what he's going to do. And Coach Raese himself, in other interviews, said that Scotty Hamilton was the only player he ever really recruited and ever wanted to recruit. So Scotty apparently was a really good basketball player. Now, the funny thing about that to me is that in later life, Scotty Hamilton was a football coach and guidance counselor at Marietta High School, where I taught for a few years, and I knew him, and I always associated him with football, never with basketball. And finally, when we moved to Charleston and I started seeing these newspaper articles about the great 1942 WVU team, and Scotty Hamilton was on this basketball team, I started asking my husband, is that the Scotty Hamilton or is that a Scotty Hamilton? And he said that is the Scotty Hamilton that we knew back in our teaching days. And also I did find out in my research that Scotty did play 1 year of football at WVU, but he was really, he was WVU's first basketball All-American. Charles Raese, in his book about his father, writes this about Hamilton, quote, "He was an awesome ball handler, and Coach Raese knew he would fit perfectly into this offensive agenda. In fact, he would be the team's floor general. With Hamilton at the helm, Raese was able to take his offensive scheme to a new level. Not only did his team's ball handling improve, but their fast break became lethal," end quote. He goes on to say this, Hamilton was smart and had an uncanny knack for knowing when and to whom he should pass the ball. When Hamilton came out of the 1942 Army game, he was given a standing ovation. You Hicks remember Scotty Hamilton as a friend with whom he would go to the wrestling mats in the upstairs of the gym after basketball practice for 15 or 20 minutes of wrestling. Hicks recalls that because Scotty was heavy and out of shape, he would get worn out during games and call a timeout. You would then take him a bucket of water and a towel. I did read in some of my sources that Scotty was a diabetic, and I don't know when this was diagnosed. It appears to me that perhaps he was undiagnosed but diabetic as a young man, and that might have accounted for his weight problem and the fact that he would tire easily. Unlike many of his teammates who had joined the Army or the Army Air Corps, Floyd Scotty Hamilton graduated and enlisted in the Navy. And he chose an enlistment date of November 30th, 1943, and a release date in April of 1946. In 1940, he had married his childhood sweetheart from Grafton, Barbara Jean, and they had 3 children. Did I tell you that for the handsome young man that there would be some fair maidens in this tale? And so that's Barbara. And we knew Barbara and Scotty as they were middle-aged when we knew them. And so it was really interesting to me to read this new information. They had 3 children, and after a brief stint of coaching at Washington and Lee, when he moved to Marietta, he became the head football coach, later guidance director and athletic director at Marietta High School. He was inducted into the WVU Sports Hall of Fame in 1996, 20 years after his death. So he would have been in his mid-50s when he died. The third person I'm going to talk about is Roger Lewis Shorty Hicks. He hailed from Moundsville in Marshall County, and he was born on Flag Day, June 14, 1920. He was the 3rd son of Walter B. and Nellie B. Pickett Hicks. Throughout his life, he was known by his friends as Shorty, and he had 2 older brothers, Harvey Lemoyne, known as Lee, and Walter Edmund, Eddie. And later, there would be another younger brother, Hugh D. Hicks. All 4 of them came of age during World War II. Roger, or Shorty, was an honors graduate of the 1938 Moundsville Senior High School, and he captained the basketball team there. He did go to Findlay College in Ohio for a couple of years, for a few months, but he later transferred to West Virginia University. Now, this is something I learned about most of the men, but maybe most about, I'm sorry, I didn't change that. But perhaps his biography points it up more than anybody's. He wasn't just a basketball player. Remember, he didn't miss a foul shot at all during the tournament. And he held the free throw percentage, 88%, that sounds pretty good to me, for 60 or so years. But he was also president of the student body and president of Phi Delta Theta fraternity. He was a member of the athletic board and also the prestigious Mountain Sphinx and Letterman's honoraries. He served as a proctor of Men's Hall, and he was a freshman basketball coach at the university for a year. I think that was after he played. He was a freshman basketball coach at the university for a year while he was completing his 4th year in ROTC. So these men were not, just basketball players. I don't know why I have to go to class. I just came here to play ball. That was not true of them. They were scholars, they were students first, and athletes second or maybe third down the line, and still they were good basketball players. In September 1944, Lieutenant Roger Hicks headed overseas as a member of a platoon in the 328th Regiment, 26th Yankee Division of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army. On the night of November 10, 1944, the patrol the young officer was leading outside Metz, France, was pinned down by mortar fire, and he was killed. His parents learned about his death about 5 days later, and he did receive the Purple Heart. After the war, his family had his remains returned to the States, and he was buried in Moundsville alongside other family members. All wars are fraught with irony, but there are numerous reasons why Shorty Hicks probably shouldn't have even been there. We now know that if multiple members of the family are in service, the government will allow one of them to be held back so that not all of them are in harm's way. He could have stayed as an instructor at Fort Benning in Georgia, an officer's instructor at Fort Benning. He didn't really have to go. So, Hugh Hicks pointed out that the 4 Hicks sons being in Europe at one time was, quote, unnecessary. But he added, Mother and Dad didn't fuss about it. And time and again, as I've researched biographies of the veterans listed on the Veterans Memorial, people have said, when my older brother signed up, and my parents didn't fuss about it. They said, go, let's get your duty, go. The other 3 Hicks brothers did come back to lead productive, successful lives in the States after the war was over. Luke Halmar. He was the last surviving member of the team, and he died in 2002. He was a native of First Glove, am I saying that right? First Glove, just west of Morgantown. And he graduated in 1942, the year of the championship, with a major in forestry. Like Hamilton, he joined the Navy, and he received a Silver Star for bravery for his involvement in the D-Day landing at Utah Beach. One account said that he was on shore helping direct fire from the British and American ships. Toward the end of the war, he did go to the Pacific Theater and served there. He was married and had a daughter, and after the war he became a businessman who migrated to South Carolina and rose to the position of Executive Vice President of the Continental Group. But throughout his life, he retained his interest in forestry, and he was a member of the Society of American Foresters for over 50 years. U. Hicks remembers Palmar's excellence in rebounding and defense, referring to him as quiet as a mouse, but a great athlete. Dick Kessling, I didn't learn a great deal about him, but he too was a modest, unassuming person. And according to U. Hicks, this Clarksburg native, did you notice that they were all from communities fairly close to Morgantown? And only the subs came from New Jersey. According to U. Hicks, this Clarksburg native was a wiry 165 pounds who could leap like nobody's business. Hicks called Kessling, quote, the quietest one, but he was the high point man and a prime target for Hamilton under the basket. Hicks added, you never knew he was around except to watch him play basketball, unquote. Throughout the 1941-42 season, Kessling set scoring records, and eventually he was made the All-NIT tournament team. The U.S. Army World War II enlistment records indicate that a Richard Kessling of Harrison County registered on August 13, 1942 at Fort Hays, Columbus, Ohio, and was branched to the fledgling Army Air Corps. At the time of his enlistment, he stated he was married and had 2 years of college. After the war, he returned to central West Virginia and eventually became a manager for Owens, Illinois in Fairmont. Okay, Charles Bud Lowell was born in Pennsylvania, but lived his young adult life in Morgantown because he just happened to be the son of the president of WVU. So he was the co-manager who got to go to the tournament in New York, and he was the only manager who got to go. As was the case with his teammates, he saw service in the military looming even before he left the university. And his enlistment record shows that he signed up on February 10, 1943, where he stated that he had 3 years of college, was in civilian life a collector of bills and accounts, and was single without dependents. These military enlistment records sometimes say things that are somewhat contrary to other things that I've read about the people. And sometimes they don't say as much education as they've had. And apparently, to list their civilian occupation, they got to choose from a list, and it isn't always a good descriptor of what they actually did. His tenure as a manager of a championship basketball team appears to be a point of pride with his family because it is mentioned in both his engagement and wedding announcements. You know how we put what fraternity we've been in or what honor society we've been in, and both his marriage and his engagement announcements mentioned the fact that he was the manager of the 1942 team. He too went to Fort Benning, and where he went to OCS, and he was commissioned as a lieutenant. In 1944, he married Lucille Hosey. There was another fair maiden, a home economics senior at the university. And after the war, he joined the Jeffrey Manufacturing Company, where he served in various management positions. Now, Neil Montoni is a very interesting one to me. Again, he was from New Jersey, and he wasn't really a member of the team at all, but he got to go to New York with the team because the coach needed a sub who would give some respite to the ones who needed it. He was a football player. He was a 4-year football player, and all he did for the basketball team was give them some depth. U. Hicks said this about Montoni. Montoni was on the football team and had played some high school basketball. So that was all he needed to do. Raese took him to New York because he wanted someone with height. Remember, he's got 3 inches of hair sticking up. He wanted someone with height to go in for a couple of minutes when a player needed rest. Now, this is the one player that I couldn't find any actual records that I wasn't clear whether he saw World War II service. Neil Montani saw service in World War II, but I'm not sure it was our guy. But the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Burrell's death file shows an enlistment date 1 of November 27, 1942, released in 1944, the following day an enlistment date 2, and released in 1947. I'm sorry. Don Raese was, as we've said before, the nephew of the coach. But he didn't seem to get any special favors out of that because he happened to be a sub, and he wasn't one of the taller players. Ironically, he did receive an appointment to West Point one day after the Army game that was in the regular season. But again, I have no indication that he ever actually attended West Point. Donald Raese was killed in a training flight in September 1946, and so why is he listed on the West Virginia Veterans Memorial? The period that's considered the period of conflict for World War II is from December 7, 1941 to the end of 1946. So he is considered to be a World War II casualty. Another piece of irony, his older brother Cleon Wilson Raese Jr. was killed in action in World War II in a flight circumstance that was very similar to the plane crash that Donald Raese was killed in. This is a family that goes way back in Tucker County. They go back about 2 to 3 generations before this group of people we're talking about came about. And so he attended public schools in Davis. He graduated from Davis High School with a class of 39. And like his brother Cleon, he attended Madison Military Academy, but later transferred to WVU. He registered to the Army in the District of Columbia, and then later was transferred to the Army Air Corps. The Parsons Advocate notes this, quote, Lieutenant Raese is the second member of his family to die while in service to the Army Air Corps. A brother, First Lieutenant Cleon Raese Jr., met death July 1st, 1944, in an airplane accident in England. Mrs. Raese said that both boys were approximately the same age when they met death. Donald Race's remains were brought back to West Virginia, where he was buried alongside his brother in the Davis Cemetery in Tucker County. And in this place, they joined several previous generations of their family, where in 54 and 71, respectively, Cleon Sr. and Selena Deary Raese, the parents, were buried. They did have a younger brother. Cleon and Donald had a younger brother, John Raese, not the ones who ran for Senate, but in every generation of Race's, there are 2 or 3 Johns, so it's very difficult to keep them all straight. John Raese was a dentist in central West Virginia for a number of years and died about 4 or 5 years ago, I believe. I did talk to the widow of the younger brother, and she was very gracious. She just wasn't able to supply any pictures because she had passed them all out to her stepchildren. And but she did talk to me for a while. And it's very wonderful to be able to talk to the families, if it's possible, of these people. Here's our Humphrey Bogart guy. Coach Richard Ambry Dyke Raese is the pivotal figure in this story, because without him, the 1942 basketball team would not be the legendary force that it's become. And indeed, the WVU basketball program today owes a great deal to this man. If he hadn't accomplished the things he did, you know, the scholarships wouldn't have started being given when they were. And there are just so many things about basketball that he started at WVU that probably the athletic department doesn't even know. He was the 10th of 11 children born in the Davis-Tucker County, West Virginia family of Minnie and John Raese, and he worked in his family's general merchandise business when he was growing up. But in 1932, he earned a degree in economics at WVU, and he played just one semester of basketball himself. He got his nickname Dyke because, depending on which source you want to believe, either he or his mother did not like the name Dick as a nickname for Richard. So he took his name from a traveling basketball team called the Kaiser Collegians that had a man on it named Dyke Schaefer, and from then on he was always called Dyke. For a while after he graduated from WVU, Coach Raese coached at his home high school in Davis with a strong record of, and he had a strong record of wins, and we've already noted something about their unusual style of play. In 1938, he was offered the job of head football coach at Spencer High School. The job came with a decent salary at the time, but he turned it down to accept a coaching job at another school at a salary that was half as much of the Spencer High position. And that school was WVU. And Raese knew a good opportunity when he saw it. Now, the sources that I read about the offer he got from Spencer High School differed somewhat, because Norman Julian said that he was offered $4,000 a year. Bob Herzl, writing for the Morgantown Dominion Post, said that he was offered $3,000 a year. And there are several reasons why I'm inclined to believe the latter. But even then, $3,000 was a lot of money. And compared to the $1,400 that he got when he started coaching at WVU. And that sort of tells you about the status of the sport at the university when they're not even going to pay the main coach at the university as much as high school is willing to pay him. Now, this is a real sidebar, and I'll tell you right now, kind of talking my own opinions here. But just recently, this last month, the Charleston Daily Mail reported that WVU Athletic Department and basketball coach Bob Huggins are renegotiating the contract that he signed after the 2008 season, and his new contract could be finished by the end of the year. And according to a sports writer for the Daily Mail, that contract was for 11 years and $27.5 million overall, including $2.3 million for the upcoming year. Now, that may not be a lot of money as far as head coaches' salaries go, but using the Consumer Price Index from 1938 to the present, Coach Raise's 1938 salary would translate to about $22,000. So somehow the sport has risen in the university's eyes. Raese took over for a coach at WVU whose name was Marshall Little Sleepy Glenn, who was rapidly burning out because he was the coach of the football team and the basketball team, and he was going to medical school. At the time, WVU didn't have a medical school, so where was he going to medical school? He was going to Rush Medical School which is in Chicago. I don't know how the logistics, I'm still trying to find out the logistics of that. How was he able to coach two sports and also take medical school classes? Did he go during the week and come back on weekends? And I mean, transportation wasn't that easy either. I don't know what the logistics of that were, and I want to find out more about that. So his nickname Little Sleepy was not because he was small of stature and he looked sleepy, but because he got by on a little bit of sleep. At WVU, let's get back to Dyke Raese. At WVU, he coached for 4 seasons and had a winning record of 55-29, getting stronger as the 4 years went on. But he knew that he was still a young man in his 30s. He was about 10 years older than his players. He knew that he was going to go into the military eventually. And he wanted to be a pilot, and he received an appointment to Randolph Field, Texas, but his dream of being a pilot vanished when he took an eye test and failed it. So he thought he was going to be drafted, but he got a much more appealing offer. He got to head up the Navy pre-flight basketball school and physical education program at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And as all future naval flyers spent some time there, he mentored a number of young officers, some of whom became famous athletes themselves after the war. And those included Otto Graham, Bud Palmer, and Paul Bear Bryant. I think you probably have heard a few of those names. He was about to be assigned to active duty on a carrier when the bombs were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus ending the war. He could have returned to coaching duties at WVU, and he also was offered the chance to coach a professional team in Cleveland, Ohio. But instead, by that time, he was married to Jane Greer, and he became he chose a career in industry and eventually became president of Greer Industries. In 1943, he had purchased and later restored the Morgantown home of West Virginia's first U.S. Senator, Wakeman T. Willey. Throughout his life, he made a lot of contributions to his city and his university. A very, very civic-minded person, as many generations of his family have been. And he passed his legacy on to his 5 sons, who were David, John, Charles, Robert, and Richard. George Rickey is another one of those New Jersey guys. This particular one came from North Bergen. Even though he can't be listed on our memorial because he actually didn't reside, isn't considered a resident of West Virginia, he actually enlisted, this is another irony, he enlisted at Morgantown. Several sources I investigated indicated that Rickey died while fighting in North Africa, but his sister provided information to the National World War II Memorial, and she states that after serving in Africa, he was sent on to Italy, where he was killed in action at Anzio. U.S. rosters of World War II dead indicate that George Rickey was buried in New York, and some sources kind of hint at the fact that he may have at some time in his life been an actor, and maybe that was the reason he was buried in New York. That's a lead that I'd like to pursue a little bit further. Dave Sennis. He graduated from Cerrito Canova High School, and as was the case with several teammates, he served in World War II in the U.S. Army Air Corps. But after that, when he returned to the States, he went to the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Sciences, and he spent his professional career as a co-owner of the Rollins Funeral Home in Cerrito Canova. When I was trying to find out information about him, I thought that the legislature itself would be the best place to learn facts about the life of Lefty Rollins, but all I really found there was that he was, that they chose to honor him after his death by naming an internship program for him. But I did find out from a colleague of his son, who was an attorney, about his funeral home connection, so I called the funeral home, and they sent me a number of obituaries, and that's how I found out some of the things about him. He later developed a very close relationship with Marshall University, and as I understand it, he was one of the first people on the scene of the Marshall plane crash. And I do believe that his funeral home supplied the body bags for the casualties in the Marshall plane crash. And Walter Rollins' longtime friend Lou McManus, a former Speaker of the House of Delegates, told a Daily Mail reporter that after that incident, Rollins relinquished his role as a funeral director. And I think that we can all understand that. He wouldn't have been a particularly old man at that time. Oh, by the way, the track at Marshall University is named for Wilson Lawrence. Charles Henry Wilson was another difficult one to research, and as time went on, I began to learn some more things about him. One of the things that happened was a nephew of his posted some information on the National World War II Memorial Site, and so I learned some facts about him there, and one of the facts I learned was what division he was in, and that led to some other investigations. I must say that when I started investigating him, I was totally on the wrong track. I was investigating another Charles Wilson from West Virginia, who also lost his life in World War II. And our colleague Mary Johnson, who introduced me, said, "Something's wrong here," and we began, and she began helping me with the investigation, and we finally came on to the information of the right person. But Charles Henry Wilson Jr. was featured in an article in a local paper that was about, the article was titled, "Strange Story of Death of 3 Boys on Same Basketball Squad, ... Fate." And that was one of the things that kind of led me to all the underlying currents that I was looking at. I'm not a fatalist, but there were just too many coincidences here that I had to start tracking things down. The article says that Charles was the last of the 3 to go overseas, and he left this country in December 1944 and was killed in France just 2 days after he was under enemy fire. He was from a large family. He had 10 siblings. The two of his older brothers died in childhood, and one of his sisters died in infancy as well. So he was the only male who grew up to adulthood, and therefore apparently, he had another Wilson brother who was born much later, did grow to adulthood, but he was the only one that was the right age to go into World War II. Here I'd like to mention a couple really good sources, and that is the National World War II Registry online is a very good source. It's very factual. It doesn't provide the kind of information that we're writing in the biographies of the people on our Veterans Memorial, but it's like bulleted points, and people can send in to honor any loved one who was in World War II and not necessarily a casualty. Also, I found out that he was in the 63rd Infantry Division, and some units in the military have their own web pages, so that when you look them up, you can kind of trace where that unit has been and what was going on at a certain time in the person's life. And I was able to kind of piece together some of the information about Charles Henry Wilson, about George Rickey, the information from his sister, and so forth. Another fact, ironic fact, Charles Wilson was born on December 7th. So when I looked at his life, he was born just 2 decades before Pearl Harbor, and he died the day that Auschwitz was liberated. I thought that gave his life a kind of symmetry, a kind of meaning. This research I'm doing is ongoing. Somebody asked me if there was a book here, and my answer to that is yes, there is a book here, and I'm not the person to write it. I would gladly share all the notes that I have and all the information I have now and anything I find in the future with anybody who wants to write the book on this, but I just don't know whether I have the stamina to write such a book, but there's a lot more that could be investigated. One of the things we know is that 3 of the principals in this story are engraved on a memorial: Roger Hicks, Dyke Raese, and Charles Wilson. We also know that Donald's brother Cleon lost his life in World War II as well. George Rickey, another valuable teammate, but he can't be listed on the WVU memorial, also perished in the conflict. This is what Governor Neely had to say when he sent a congratulatory telegram to Coach Raese. Now, I don't know much about Governor Neely, but one of the things I've learned is, from a little bit of West Virginia history is that he was not a man of few words, and he was not a man of understatement. And so Governor Neely sent this telegram, quote, "In my opinion, no other athletic team in the history of the nation ever in a similar length of time earned greater renown for its alma mater than yours has earned for West Virginia in the series of thrilling battles gloriously completed in Madison Square Garden tonight. That success as surpassing as that which you now enjoy may attend all of you to the end of your days is my sincere hope and earnest prayer." End of quote. Well, of course, we know that didn't happen for all of them. Something else that we should note here is that basketball players at that era likely fit the true definition of scholar athlete. They did not go to the university to play basketball. They went to obtain an education. There were no scholarships. They paid their own way, or their families paid their own way, and these were families of modest means. So they were serious people. They often worked at various odd jobs because the rules were a little different then. Their known affiliation with ROTC, some of them at least, indicates that they actively pursued leadership roles. These were men who were among our best and brightest, and who knows what they might have achieved. If you look at the ones who didn't come back compared to the ones who did come back, we lost a very valuable group of people here. Studs Terkel's 1970s compilation of World War II biographical sketches is called The Good War. It was good in the sense that it helped end the Great Depression, it allowed a generation of young Americans to experience broader vistas, and provided greater educational opportunities for those who returned home. But however necessary, global conflicts are inherently not good, as members of the 1942 WVU basketball team will quickly learn. And so we learned that for our tale, there is no happy ending. It's easy to think about the discussions they might have had on their road trips. We know that they had to be talking about the war in that 1941-1942 season. The war had already begun at the time the tournament was going on, and they knew it was looming in their future. There was a draft. But it also seems that the leadership skills that they honed on the court, in the classroom, and in their extracurriculars transferred readily to their military service. And that's about all I have to say. Oh, I do have 3 more good pictures to show to you. This particular presentation has been the collaborative effort of many people here at Archives and History, because they have listened and listened to me and talk about this stuff. And some of them have contributed some very good information themselves. And just last week, Susan Skouras, the librarian at Archives and History, came to me very excited because she had found 3 new pictures in an Elks program that came out right after the tournament. And there we have and the captions are straight from the Elks tournament. I didn't make up the captions. But that's the tournament right after, the team right after they won the tournament. And I can practically name the people, although I keep getting Ricky and Rollins mixed up, but I think I can figure out pretty much who they are, and I do not know who that gentleman is on the right. That is the team in the celebration with Governor Neely in the middle. And remember the uncomplimentary remarks that I read to you at the beginning, and one recent reporter called them a band of ragamuffins. Do they look like a band of ragamuffins to you? They don't look like a band of ragamuffins to me. They're dressed there in their Sunday best. And there we have Kessling, and Governor Neely's got his hand on Kessling's knee, and Rudy Berry sort of shyly smiling next to Governor Neely. Scotty Hamilton sitting on the left arm, and Shorty Hicks sitting on the right arm. And then in the back we have Ricky Rollins, Ricky, Montoni, his hair didn't get cut in that picture, Donald Raese, Kessling, and kind of hiding in the back there, Coach Raese. And what would we have been doing? Well, we would have been somewhere listening to the radio, listening to the exploits of that team. I'd like to thank all those people here at Archives and History who really helped me a lot with the article I wrote and with the presentation tonight, not the least of which are the director, Joe Geiger, and his assistant director, Brian Ward, who helped set up the technology for this, and the library director, Bobby Taylor. My colleague, Constance Baston, you have her name. If any of you can be a resource or know anything about anybody who's on the West Virginia Veterans Memorial, Constance would gladly take your call and get the information. We encourage families to write the stories of their loved ones. But if you know somebody who perished in a 20th century conflict, and you don't want to write the story, we'll research it and write it and then run it past you or whoever knows and about that person, and then before we post it online. Constance Baston is the contact person, and her name is on the handout that I passed out to you. A person here who writes a lot about history and is a great model for writing about history is Terry Lowry, and he's been an immense help to me as I've been doing my writing. Mary Johnson, as I said, got me on the right track when I got off the right track, and the secretary, Susan Holbrook, and I have really bonded because she listens to all my chattering. My husband, John McClure, is the real genealogist for the family. He's back there in the light blue shirt. And he also helped scan the pictures for this presentation, and he's listened to a lot of stories over the years. But I listen to his stories too. Finally, we are really, really graced by a presence, and I'm almost overwhelmed to be able to say this to you. But we have with us tonight the brother of one of those who perished from the basketball team. He's got a very good mind. He'll probably even tell you how old he is, but I won't do that. Mr. U. Hicks, would you let people know who you are? Shorty Hicks. And I've spoken to him on the phone. He always returned my phone calls, and he's been so gracious to talk to me. But it's just been a real treat to actually get to meet him in person tonight. And that's all I have to say. Any questions?